Hey, folks, I have long been fascinated by the early days of professional wrestling. And what I mean by that specifically is the days before Vince McMahon and the WWF, WWE took over the universe, the days of territories, the powerhouses with the NWA, Mid-South, so many others, including the AWA. And on the podcast this week is a man who is not only known as the voice of Minnesota wrestling, but also, whether he intended to become one or not, a great historian of those great days of professional wrestling. He's been a columnist, a photographer, a ring announcer, and commentator. He's done everything. He's done it all. Welcome, Mick Karch. Mick, thanks for coming on Primetime. How are you?
It's a pleasure, Sean. I'm doing very, very well. You mentioned that I had done pretty much everything in the business except make money. So it was pretty cool. 9 out of 10 isn't bad, but it's great to be with you.
Hey, great to have you. I know it took us a little bit to get you. You've been under the weather a little bit, but I'm so glad that we were able to get this together. And you mentioned, making money. We just had Sabu on, and he's another guy that was just a tremendous performer. Just really stood out among some of the greats, and yet he was saying, I just was never in the right place, or something happened, and and he just turned buckets of money away. And hey, it happens. I certainly could. We could probably talk about that in a bar over a beer sometime, but we've got a lot of other stuff to talk about first.
Absolutely.
Let's start with Minnesota because I know that's very near and dear to your heart, and of course the AWA, but. When you go back at the history of professional wrestling, and especially those days, Minnesota, my God, there were just so many greats came out of that area. And, I've had quite a few on, and it's just amazing to me. And it's, you can kind of explain it in a sense that the AWA and Gagne and all these guys lived there, and then their kids grew up there. But why Minnesota? Why do you think Minnesota has played such a rich part of professional wrestling history?
Well, obviously you have to start with Verne. Even before Verne was involved in the AWA promotion end of it, when he got more power, etc., Verne was already so hugely popular here in the 1950s. And he was working at the same time, guys like Leo Namalini and Butch Levy, guys like this that came out of the University of Minnesota, they all kind of came out at the same time in the 50s. And then, of course, Verne he became a household name on the Dumont Network out of Chicago in the 50s. And then in the early 60s, of course, when he took over the promotion with Wally Carbo, then he became such a powerhouse and opened up his training facility. And then everybody just followed. The first guy that comes to mind with me is Larry Hennig. Larry was, a little bit younger than Verne, but Larry went to Robbinsdale High School, as did guys like, Rick Rude and John Norden, etc.
Yeah.
But it just started to follow that all of a sudden Minnesota became a wrestling powerhouse. And to this day, I suppose you could, toss Brock Lesnar into the mix, and of course Brad Ringens from back in the day, and Gagne and Brunzell, and et cetera, et cetera. It just happened, and then everybody started gravitating to Minnesota and Verne's camp if they wanted to get into the business.
And it is just amazing, and we kind of talk about we got into that new generation, and all those people, Joe Laurinaitis and. Barry Darso. I mean, the list goes on. All these guys went to high school together or in that same area. But before that, and you mentioned, and I don't know if it was geography. That's just where Verne Gagne decided that's where he planted his flag, But I think we need to back up even a little bit more on that and talk about, the way these territories were formed. And we talk about the NWA, which a lot of people just see as this wrestling organization, but it was kind of the, the standard bearer of that alliance that all of these territories had at one time. And they all worked together. It was, and I often describe it as kind of like a mafia territory, the way they divided it up without, the whacking guys and doing that kind of thing. But it was kind of the same way that organization was put together, right? I mean, tell me a little bit about how that all worked back then from what you remember.
The NWA was definitely the powerhouse, and I'm going to use Minneapolis as an example. Minneapolis was part of the NWA territory. And, I'm a wrestling collector, and, part of the stuff that I have in my collection, I'll see these letters that went from Fred Kohler or whoever that was an NWA powerhouse back in the day, Sam Muchnick, on and on and on. And, you described it, Sean, as a little bit of a mafia situation. Obviously, that would be, a little bit over the top. But in the sense that the NWA really was a powerhouse. They were a governing body. They had tremendous power, tremendous say-so. And the cities and towns and areas that were under their jurisdiction really had to fall into line. If they didn't, they fell out of favor with the NWA. So it was really interesting because Verne and the AWA were really the first group that had the guts and the balls, I guess, to splinter off and say, okay, you know what? That's enough. We're going to do our own thing here. We think we have enough of a fan base. We don't need to be under your jurisdiction anymore. And that sort of opened up the floodgates, because then you had the old, WWF and, all the groups that followed, WWA with Dick the Bruiser and Wilbur Snyder. But I think in the sense that, if you look at history, Verne and the AWA and Wally Carbo were the first group to really cut the ties, if you will, with the NWA. Very interesting. But to your point, the NWA was a tremendous powerhouse, and they had a stranglehold on the wrestling business for, many, many years.
Yeah, and a lot of people don't understand that, because they look at what Vince McMahon did and they went like, oh my God, he just took over all these territories and didn't care what anybody else thought. But, before that, in many ways, it was already controlled like that across the country, because people respected their territories, as they called them, and they would exchange talent. Nobody crossed over into other and did shows in their territory. And then you did have people that there were promoters out there said, I don't want to be part of this. And they tried to do different things. Most of the time they were shut down. But Gagne, as you mentioned, was one of those who was able to really pull it off initially. And it wasn't as though they just stayed in Minnesota. I mean, they had eventually, shows all over the country. And I think that that's something else that people don't realize either, that, they were in Milwaukee, they were in Chicago, they were in these cities, even out west in Denver and in California and San Francisco. So it wasn't like Vince was this incredible visionary. It was not that these guys didn't have the same ideas. He just pulled it off in a major way years later.
Yeah, there's no question about it. And, you mentioned the AWA's influence and the power that they had. And it's interesting, because the modern day wrestling fan, if you really don't, go back in time as a wrestling historian or a longtime fan, you don't realize just how good and the expanse that the AWA had. You made a very good point. Some of the cities that you mentioned. And, of course, they went into Japan when Bockwinkel and Stevens were the AWA Tag Team Champions. They went to Florida, Winnipeg, and then, of course, Leo Nomlini that I mentioned before was promoting for them out in San Francisco, North and South Dakota, Milwaukee, Green Bay, Chicago. And this was like consistent. Every single month, all the AWA major cities were running, and they would run the circuit, and there was a time when everybody was selling out. They'd draw 12,000, 13,000 people in Milwaukee, and the next night they're in Minneapolis, they're drawing another 10 to 15,000 people, and the same in Chicago. So the AWA, I would say from probably, middle 1960s, at least until the early 1980s, was an amazingly successful promotion.
Yeah. And they all had television, and folks don't think that they weren't thinking the same thing when these superstations came along and cable. They wanted to do the same thing. It's just that, Vince was ahead of the game on that, had been taking syndicated programming and literally buying airtime across the country. But they all had these ideas. It's just that Vince is the one who ended up on top of it all. But I think in some reason I like to bring that up is because a lot of people think that it was just Vince, that Vince had this idea and they all were like, whoa, how can he do this? Well, they had the same idea. He just pulled it off.
Absolutely. I agree with you 100%. Everybody had the vision, but nobody did anything about it. And then, whether you love the guy or hate the guy or whatever, Vince really rolled the dice, with the first WrestleMania and what have you. And then all of a sudden, all these other promoters, suddenly it became an abhorrent thing to do, to take over all the territories. When you're right, Sean, they all thought about it, but nobody ever pulled the trigger.
Yeah, and some did try it to some extent, but they didn't really get anywhere. Otherwise, we'd be probably talking about a different organization than WWE. But let's get back to AWA, because in its heyday, it was incredible. And I mentioned, because, of course, I worked with a lot of those guys, Curt Hennig and Rick Rude and all those guys. But before them, there was this other generation. You mentioned Larry, Larry the Axe. There were just some great professional wrestlers that are still legends to this day. Who were some that really stood out to you during that time? And you're growing up at this point when these guys were all there. So tell me about some of those days of the AWA and what it was like back then.
Well, it was absolutely amazing, and not only was it a time for the talent, but the fans were believers at the time. So if you went to one of these house shows, the heat, the electricity was incredible. Even before it actually became the AWA, Minneapolis was a hotbed. I go back through some old wrestling programs. Anybody who was everybody would come through the Minneapolis territory. But when I started following wrestling, which goes back all the way to 1960, I guess the guys that I think about most as you look at the AWA roster, the Crusher, of course, Crusher Wasowski. Before Hulk Hogan in the AWA, it was Crusher. And you had Billy Robinson and Nick Bockwinkel, Ray Stevens, Wahoo McDaniel, Jeff Ports, Horst Hoffman, Baron von Raschke, the Hennigs. I mean, the list is absolutely endless. Ric Flair, of course, started to cut his teeth in the AWA. The list is endless. They were a powerhouse. Edouard Carpentier, Bill Miller, the Destroyer, Dick Beyer, Billy Red Lyons, Fred Bastien, on and on and on, Dick the Bruiser. These are the guys that I grew up with. And again, for probably the period, at least 65 through 75 or so, those were the mainstay guys. I mentioned the Crusher. Whenever any heel would take over the territory and run roughshod for 6-7 months, the call would always go out to the Crusher. But, and Crusher would come in and they'd have their cage match or their lumberjack match or whatever it was, the big blow-off match, fill the building, sell it out. And again, it was a different era where everybody believed, and it was phenomenal. Memories for a lifetime. And I'm just fortunate that I had a chance not only to watch these guys, but to rub elbows as well.
And it couldn't have gone on forever, but you hear people talk about those studio shows, and there really was this incredible local feel to it that people really felt a part of it, whether you were there or you were watching on, local television, whatever your viewing area was at the time. But what do you remember of those house shows and the atmosphere? Because we know what it's like today. It's rock star status when you go to these, and there's 10, 20,000 people. But back then, what was the atmosphere like in those house shows?
I would say let's take a look at the Minneapolis Auditorium, first of all. I mean, this is a building that comfortably would seat, maybe 8,000, 9,000 people. And on a big show where you had the blow-off match or the lumberjack match or whatever, the building was filled to the rafters. It was intimate, and I keep referring to the people that believed, and that's what created the atmosphere. I mean, there were times when I would literally sit in the stands, before I got into, the journalism part of it, and I'd watch people, and I'd count them up, 15, 20 people getting tossed out of the building for fighting, and missing the main event. I was there at the auditorium one night when a fan got into the ring. I remember Dusty Rhodes and Dick Murdoch were wrestling Nick Bockwinkel and Ray Stevens. And you would think, you got 4 heels. Well, the fans took to Rhodes and Murdoch as the baby faces, and at one point, Bockwinkel and Stevens were getting the better of them, and a fan hit the ring with a knife, and all of a sudden you got bodies going all over the place, and referees are decking people, and security is in there, and that was the atmosphere. And There was no pyro. There was no, commercial breaks. There were, if you held a sign up, up in the balcony, the usher would come take it down because you were blocking somebody's view, let alone encouraging you to hold up a sign. It was just amazing. And unless you lived through it, through that era where it was the suspension of disbelief, you have no idea the electricity and the absolute fervor and just intensity that the fans had. I remember, just as kind of a diversion here or a little segue, Bill Miller, Dr. Bill Miller, wrestled here in the AWA in the early 1960s under a mask as Mr. M. And he was a great collegiate wrestler, friend of Verne Gagne's, but they were doing a program where M had the title. And in August of 1962, he's going to drop the strap to Verne, and then he would unmask. Well, the finish, Verne goes over, and the old Minneapolis auditorium was set up in such a way that the balcony, literally, if a wrestler would walk underneath the balcony out into the hallway, a fan could reach over and touch him on the way out. Yeah. So Miller, who was like 6'6" and 300 plus pounds, is walking out. He's just wrestled. He's got his mask in his hand. And because the balcony was so low, a fan, if you want to call him that, took a 2x6 plank, a wooden plank that had a 1/8 inch steel spike at the end of it. Jeez. And he hit Miller on top of the head as Miller was going underneath the overhang, the balcony overhang that led to the locker room. And, well, long story short, the fan got away with it. And I saw Miller probably 12 years later. He came in again in 1974 in Minneapolis. And I said, "Do you remember the incident?" He said, "Do I remember it?" And he leaned forward and he showed me this deep scar that he still had on his head. Wow. And he said, "I'm a veterinarian by trade. And I remember when this happened, first I thought I got shot, and then I went into the locker room, and I literally put my thumb in my head and felt my brain," not to be graphic. Yeah. But that would, I think that speaks to how nuts the fans were at the time. And that carried on into the 70s when they were taking shots at the ring at Bobby Heenan and Nick Bockwinkel in Chicago, literally, shot. Roddy Piper getting stabbed, Ole Anderson. So definitely different time, different era, just apples and oranges.
Yeah, but it's amazing, and a lot of people have told stories like that on the podcast. I mean, Hacksaw, talks about when he was down in Mid-South, and if they poked their head out at the crowd before they started the show, and if there was 6 or 8 fights, they knew it was going to be a really great night because that's kind of how they measured the crowd. How many brawls there were and how many they had to throw out before they started. But it was, people were just. That was their wrestling. I mean, they were very, very defensive when it came to talking about those different territories, and they were all like that. But it was just what an incredible time. And we mentioned some of the guys that passed through the AWA, and at some point or another, everybody would come through, but. I know Nick Bockwinkel was a big influence on you, and I only had the chance when I worked with Nick. He was an agent with the WWF at the time, but
yes,
I don't know what he was like as a wrestler. I just hear the stories. But what was it about him? And he helped launch a lot of careers. I mean, Hulk Hogan was one of them. But
absolutely, yeah.
What was it about Nick back then that I wish I would have seen him in the ring?
When Nick came to the AWA territory, and this is in the fall of 1970, I had read about him in the magazines, but it doesn't necessarily jump out at you. He had been wrestling in Georgia prior to him coming to the AWA, and I did a kind of nondescript, and when Nick Bockwinkel is coming to town. Well, his TV personality and his aura and his persona was completely different than anything we'd ever seen before. He came in as a heel, but he wasn't ranting and raving and screaming. Now all of a sudden you had this intellectual and, using the $1 million words and referring to the fans as the humanoids and the 8 to 5, White Soxers and what have you. So the heat that Nick generated when he came in with the pompous, arrogant attitude was off the charts. The other part of Nick that was so tremendous, Sean, is his ability to make the other guy look good.
Yeah.
People talk about how great Ric Flair was. I'm a Ric Flair fan. I enjoy Ric Flair, but to me, so much of Ric's matches were the same over the years. Very predictable spots and what have you. Nick wasn't like that. Depending on who he wrestled, it comes to mind Rufus Jones, or he'd wrestle the Crusher, Mad Dog Vachon, somebody like that, or he'd wrestle a Billy Robinson. He was able to adapt his style where he made them look like $1 million. And as a champion, if you hated the guy, you always left the building thinking, you know what, he didn't get him this time, or, the babyface didn't get him this time, but damn it, he's going to get him next time. Bockwinkel escaped by the skin of his teeth or whatever. And that, to me, was the mark of a champion, to make the other guy look good. He carried himself as a champion, very intellectual. The Bockwinkel that you saw on TV was really the way he conducted himself outside the ring. So, and again, a guy like Hulk Hogan, boy, when Hulk didn't win the strap from Bockwinkel back here in, I believe, 1983 or whatever, it was as close to a full-scale riot as I've ever seen in Minneapolis. So, and then pairing him with Bobby Heenan, that was the icing on the cake. That was a stroke of brilliance. And to me, again, I'm very biased, but I think Nick is probably the greatest champion that I ever saw, bar none.
The AWA was certainly played a big role in Hulk Hogan's career. But how did Nick play a role in that? And I think you just kind of you touched on it here, but it wasn't long after that the Hulk would really be launched on his way, and of course WrestleMania, and then history from there. But how big a role do you think he played in getting him there?
I think it was tremendous. When Hulk came into town, you can't imagine this guy's popularity. I mean, people watch the WWF, WWE, and they know the Hulk Hogan when he arrived on the scene there. But when he came into town, into the AWA area, I'd never seen anything like it. With all the baby faces over the years, nobody got the kind of response that Hogan did.
Wow,
as a result,
you could tell then.
Yeah, it was amazing. And as a result, the fans really thought this time, this is the guy that's going to win the title. There was no question in anybody's mind that sooner or later Hogan was going to win the AWA title. Well, Verne's philosophy was, he trusted Nick explicitly, because Nick had been a very, very loyal employee all those years. Again, you put Nick in the ring with anybody and he's going to carry him and make him look good. So Verne's philosophy was Hogan doesn't need the title. He can keep chasing the title. He doesn't have to have it. And, as history will bear out, whether or not there was a smart decision on Verne's part or a not so smart decision, whatever. But the matches that Hogan and Nick had together, and Nick sold his ass off for Hogan. They were tremendous. So they played off of each other very, very well. And I think that may have been, at that point, considering how great that feud was going and the numbers that St. Paul and all over the AWA were drawing with Hogan and Bockwinkel on top, that may have been an impetus for Vince to say, all right, now's the time. Let's pull the trigger. We're going to get this guy.
Yeah. And you mentioned, of course, Hulk, and he would go on to great heights. I mean, we could, we don't have to really go into explaining that, but there were others. You mentioned Bobby Heenan, and Bobby was great in another way, as far as promoting talent. And did you see early on with him just how great he was and the talent that he possessed?
Right from the very beginning. There's no doubt about it. And this is, of course, when he came to the AWA. He had worked for Dick the Bruiser before he came into the AWA, but he was here actually going back as far as the late 60s. But as time went on, his brilliance, literally his brilliance, became so obvious. Nobody got more heat as a heel ever than Bobby Heenan. Just extraordinary. And as a wrestler, too, not only as a manager. Nick used to say, if he and Ray Stevens were booked for a town and one of them couldn't make it and the promotion put Bobby Heenan in as a replacement, Nick said the match was much better and the crowd was much more excited having Bobby in there than they were either Bockwinkel or Stevens. And that's really saying something. I think Bobby is in a class by himself. Everything he did, whether or not it was managing or, wrestling or whatever it did, or, when they kind of made him a comic foil with Gorilla Monsoon, I think the guy was absolutely brilliant. And I think in a lot of ways, he may be the best all-around performer ever in wrestling. He could do everything.
Yeah, and you mentioned that a lot of people don't talk about how great Bobby was in the ring, but you look back at, for example, those Weasel matches and the bumps he would take and the reactions that he had. That he would be out and then he'd wake up, and you bought it, and he really some of the bumps he used to take the ring, I used to just be blown away. I was like, geez, I never, because I didn't know his background, that how much time he spent in the ring, and he could take a bump of the best of them.
To me, one of my favorite moves, and I don't know if you remember this offhand, there would be the one where Bobby would get whipped into the corner, into the turnbuckle, and he would go up and over the top of the turnbuckle onto the floor without grabbing onto a rope, without doing anything, just one fluid motion. And it was absolutely amazing. And as you said, he bumped for everybody, and he made everybody look good. Bobby, of course, playing the consummate coward, would get into the ring, he'd do the back pedal and then he'd, jump over the top rope or whatever. There was nothing that the guy couldn't do. And I think people really wanted to love him, but by the same token, they figured, this guy isn't so tough, so they didn't fear him, and it was okay to boo him the way they did, although that in itself translated, of course, into some terrible incidents. I mentioned that one in Chicago, where the fan was shooting at the ring towards Bobby. If you look at some of Bobby's early publicity pictures, there's one scar that he has going literally all the way across his forehead. And that wasn't a self-inflicted wound. He's walking out of the ring one night in Chicago, Sean, excuse me, and a fan, again, I use the term loosely, is waiting for him in the hallway and took a claw hammer with the claw end and nailed Bobby right between the eyes. And this is again pretty typical of what was going on back in the era, especially in Chicago, where this happened. But Bobby was fearless to a fault, and just a phenom in all aspects.
Yeah, and in his announcing too, and I always talk about him and Gorilla team together. And I know you actually had a chance to sit next to him with microphones on. But we'll get into some of the work he did behind the mic. But we talking about another great performer who wasn't necessarily one who got in the ring once in a while, but not too often, was Gene Okerlund, who of course is remembered as not just one of the greatest voices, but one of the greatest stickmen as far as interviews went. And he was from Minnesota, and another guy. He was basically a salesman, and boy, could he!
Oh my God! My first recollection of Gene, he actually was a disc jockey, top 40 disc jockey on a radio station in Minneapolis back in the days when the Beatles were big in the 1960s, and he called himself Gene Leader, the lovable leader, Gene Leader. That was his radio name. And, Gene just fell into the position again. It was one of those situations where Marty O'Neill, the longtime Minneapolis announcer, had been taken ill and had a couple of heart attacks. And they put Gene in front of the microphone. And when I first saw him, I got to say, this guy, boy, talk about a carny, talk about a carnival barker. Yeah. But, man, he fell into that role, and he became so comfortable with it, and it became so easy for him. And I think that's the legacy of Gene. You could tell he loved what he was doing. His interaction with the guys was beyond. I go on YouTube sometimes and I'll look at the Gene Okerlund botches and bloopers and, outtakes and so forth. Absolutely legendary. And yeah, again, another Minnesota guy. I got to know Gene a little bit over the years. Always very respectful, very fan friendly, and he's an icon, no doubt.
Yeah, as I often say, there's Gene, and then there's the rest of us. You can't
There
really
you go.
put anybody up there. I mean, seriously. And you know, I had the great fortune to work next to him for those years that I was there. But it really is amazing to me that when you think of all the talent that came out of that area, and you know, we've mentioned just a few of them. But what is it? And let's talk a little bit about your career that got you into wrestling, and I guess at a very young age. Was it? You've already mentioned some of those memories you have, but what caught your attention? What got you into following wrestling as a young kid?
You know, I think pretty much like everybody else, I happened to turn on television and flipping channels, and then all of a sudden there's wrestling,
Yeah.
and I'm hooked immediately. And I was 9 years old. Excuse me, 9 years old at the time. And one half of the AWA Tag Team Champions was Tiny Mills back in the day. A big 6'5" lumberjack, and he and Stan Kowalski were champions when I started watching wrestling. And so I flip on the tube, and I see Marty O'Neill, who was our announcer, is about 5'7", 5'8", and Tiny Mills is massive. And he's got Marty O'Neill, and he's shaking him by the lapels, demanding a match with Verne Gagne, what have you. Well, you know, I'm 9 years old, and, you know, I got the Roadrunner, and I got Mickey Mouse on the other stations, but I got this guy beating up on this little guy here, and I was hooked for life. I mean, that was it. Started publishing some fan newsletters when I was 13 years old. That was way back, obviously, before the internet, when wrestling fans, the means of correspondence was through the wrestling magazines, through the fan club pages. You'd exchange programs and newsletters and so forth. So, you know, I put out a couple of rinky-dink wrestling newsletters on my little mimeograph machine or whatever it was at home, and ran a fan club for Crusher Lasowski in the 60s. And but I right from day one, I have just been absolutely enthralled with the business. Took me a couple of years to realize what wrestling was all about, despite what, you know, my folks and my grandparents were telling me. I didn't want to believe it, but it's when the reality hits and you finally accept what the business is that you really get that appreciation for what these men and women do, how they have people in the palm of their hand, from their athleticism to their acting ability to whatever it is, the charisma. They're a breed among themselves. So I was just hooked and enthralled right from the beginning, right from 9 years old.
Yeah, you know, and everybody has that. I guess they call it the smart when they become smart, but. As you said, I mean, in some ways, it gives you even more appreciation of what they do. And to me, it's always been entertainment. Everything that to me, it's like what entertains me. And then when you think what these guys are able to do and take you on a ride, and back then, I mean, you talk about storylines and being able to control a crowd. You look back at some of the matches where these guys, they might be 60-minute matches. And they could do an armbar for 3 minutes, or and the crowd was just enthralled because these guys were such magicians with how they controlled how people felt. It coursed through their veins. They knew exactly what the best could do. Is they knew when they needed to bring them down. They knew how to bring them up. They knew how, and by the time they get to that climax, they're exhausted, and then they deliver. And it's, I think that in a lot of ways, especially people who grew up during that time, that's what they miss more than anything. It's not that we see incredible athleticism today,
right,
but it's the storytelling that was just incredible. Because now you look at those matches and you go, you show that to somebody today, they 2 minutes, their eyes are glazed over. Where back then,
absolutely,
No,
you're so right. And you mentioned the psychology of it, taking people on their roller coaster ride and telling the story. If you had a high spot or 2 or 3 in a match, that was it. If a guy put somebody else in a pile driver, it was over. If you got clotheslined, it was over.
Yeah.
It was building that crescendo to the finale, to the Gagne sleeper hold or the drop kick or whatever it may be. And now you see that a million times a match. And to your point, Sean, absolutely. I sat with somebody and showed him some YouTube videos of some stuff from the 1960s. And I thought, this is great stuff. And they're thinking, I don't get this. I don't get this. How come they're not coming off the top rope? How come they're not this? How come they're not that? Well, the reality is there's no psychology. There is no real storytelling today. The line between heels and baby faces, you know as well as anybody, is completely blurred. Even when Hogan came into the AWA back in 1981 or 80, whenever he came in, the intent was to make him a heel, but the fans weren't buying it. It's a whole different crowd. It's a Road Warriors crowd. They'll turn on Roman Reigns. They'll turn on John Cena. So to explain the way it was back in the day to the modern day wrestling fan, without the pyros, without the $500,000 TV tapings, when it was just 4 lights above the ring, guy came in with no entrance music, and then they took the fans on the ride for anywhere from 20 to 60 minutes, and they set up the next match, the rematch, the blow-off match, whatever it was. There's no description of how great it was.
Yeah, no, and it really is incredible. And, they can't go back to that. That's obvious the way people's attention spans are today. But I really do think that there could be a better appreciation of storytelling, because after you come off a balcony and do a flip into a crowd of of people and chairs, and okay, so now what?
Exactly.
And it not that it isn't just an incredible athleticism, but I go to a movie, take me for a ride. I come to a match. I want to be entertained. Tell me a story.
Well, so much has changed about the business, Sean, that's played into that too. Yeah. Whether it's the shoot interviews or the behind the scenes stuff, or everybody knowing what it is, and the fans have become so much a part of it. Literally, or they think they're a part of it, to the point where they hijack some shows, with their chants or whatever. Right. The ladies are in the ring. You can have Natalya working her ass off against somebody, and the fans are chanting for CM Punk. What that tells you is that they're not paying attention. They're there to be a part of the spectacle, and they're not engaged. They're not wholeheartedly involved in feeling for the baby face or for the heel. It's part of the show. It's like the sitcom. It's like a weekly soap opera, whatever it is. So in that sense, too, the eras are totally different. And what's interesting about it, I've had some people say, well, everybody has always known it's fake. No, that's not. First of all, I bristle at fake because, you get in the ring and somebody body slams you from 6 feet. I don't care. Unless you know what you're doing, it's going to hurt like hell.
Oh,
choreographed, yes. Fake, no. But people have to be invested in the product. And if they're not, then they do get bored. Even the fans that are, sitting there at ringside with their chants. But to say people always knew, no, that's not true. I can tell you back in the day, and I'm sure you know this too, there was still that element of disbelief. There was no internet where you knew some guy was moving to another territory, or he was having contract problems, or whatever the case may be. So you had your own little enclosed circle of, this is my promotion. You invested in it, and it was just a whole different ballgame, totally different than what it is today.
Yeah, and that's the word. You said they came invested. They were there, like I said, ready to go for the ride. They that's why they came, and they were invested in those characters, and those guys lived those characters. Those guys back in the days of the WWF, they didn't just step out of the arena and then got into the limo or whatever, and then we'll see you next week. It was a whole different world. It really is. And referring to that time for you, did you always, was it a dream of yours to become an announcer? or was it something that you just got on the path from doing all these different things, and they needed a ring announcer one night, and then something else happened? Was that always something you wanted to do?
Always, right from the very beginning. I mean, once I started watching wrestling on a regular basis and watching Marty O'Neill, I wanted to do that. For about 5 minutes, I entertained the idea of actually wrestling at some point, but then that quickly got squashed. I figured it's much safer, behind the microphone. But it's something that I always wanted to do, and I always wanted to be in the broadcasting business, whether or not it was wrestling or not. At times I wanted to be a top 40 disc jockey or a TV announcer or whatever. So that part of it, I always wanted to do that. But Marty O'Neill was like a role model for me. And that's something I always wanted to do. And little by little by little, I would start, maybe calling matches in my own bedroom, turn down the TV and, and call the moves and what have you. And that eventually, for me, I got a break, and I followed the dream, and I'm very lucky. Middle 1980s, I caught a break with Eddie Sharkey's group here in Minneapolis, and that started the announcing road for me. But always wanted to do it.
Did you have any idea? I mean, you said you caught a break. That with AWA Championship Wrestling. I mean, like, what a great opportunity with them being on a sports network. When you got that opportunity, were you were you ready for it? Was it just one of those opportunities and you're like, yes, I'm here, I'm ready? I mean, I was ready for it. Believe me, I was ready for it for a long, long time. And Wally Carbo, the Minneapolis promoter, was kind of a confidant of mine. And, he knew that I wanted to get into the announcing business. And he said, you got to be patient. Something will happen for you. Sometime there'll be a break for you, what have you. I was kind of my own worst enemy in kind of a strange way, because I would go to the AWA TV tapings at the Calhoun Beach Hotel, the old studio matches. Mm-hmm. And there was a group of us that would cheer the heels. And this is back in the day where you just didn't cheer the heels. And we would drive Gagne nuts, and we would, they just hated us, that we were making that much noise. So I kind of figured, well, I burned this bridge. They're never going to look at me or take me seriously, if I want an announcing position with this group. But I kind of cut my teeth working for Eddie Sharkey's PWA, and I was always ready, like I say. Interesting how it happened. In 1986, the fall of 86, Sharkey's group actually ran a show, or they were called to do a show up in Winnipeg, Canada, for a guy named Tony Condello, who had been an AWA enhancement wrestler in the 70s. Now he ran his own promotion in Winnipeg, which was an offshoot of the NWA. Really, really offshoot. I should make that clear. But we were doing TV for Sharkey, myself, and George Shire, another local wrestling historian. We got the call to come up and do TV. And I just thought to myself, you know what? I'm going to have somebody take a look at this tape and see and critique it. And am I just, trying to stick Jello to a tree here, or is this something that I can really pursue this dream? Mm-hmm. So George Shire and I called, of all people, Nick Bockwinkel, over to George's home, because we had been friends with Nick for years. And we said, we just want you to watch this. Tell us what you think. So Nick comes over there one Sunday afternoon, and we're watching the TV tapings from Winnipeg. And, he's kind of nodding his head, and I'm not, saying a heck of a lot to him. And at the very end of it, he said, you know what? He says, if you guys can get this crap over, and it was horrible, I got to tell you. He said, if you guys can get this crap over, you can do anything. Yeah. I think, okay, well, that's, kind of a left-handed vote of confidence, but still, It's a vote of confidence. About 6 months later, I was working at a full-time job, 40 hours a week, doing customer service in Minneapolis, get a phone call, and it's Greg Gagne. And Greg says, and I had known Greg for years, but not a real close, just kind of a hi, how are you kind of a relationship. Yeah. And he said, I'm calling to see if you would be interested in doing some ring announcing for the AWA. We're going to start doing regular TV tapings at the Showboat Hotel in Las Vegas. Nick Bockwinkel put you over to me.
I know of you. I've seen you around for years. Would you be interested in coming down and auditioning to be the ring announcer for the AWA? And this is probably June of 1987. I said, absolutely, I would.
Yeah.
And I went down to their TV studio, did some auditioning, and got the call and debuted as a ring announcer for the AWA in August of 87 in Minneapolis. And then for probably the next 6, 7, 8 months, I went out to the Showboat in Vegas and did their regular tapings. To your point, it was a thrill. It was like I went from the frying pan to the fire at one point, and all of a sudden I'm on ESPN on national TV, and here we are, dream come true.
And how did the opportunity to do some commentary come about?
Well, it's interesting. I had approached Verne, actually, as we were flying out one time, and I said, I love doing the ring announcing for you, Verne, but I have done this and this and this for Eddie Sharkey's group. I've done this for a while. I'd really like to maybe sit in and do color. It was Rod Trongard, who was the AWA play-by-play guy at the time. I said, I'd love to work with Rod. Well, Verne's response, in typical Verne fashion, was, what makes you think you're a better color commentator than I am, or Ray Stevens is? And I just kind of shook my head and I said, Verne, I'm just throwing it out there.
Yeah.
So long story short, they were doing a storyline where Curt Hennig and Greg Gagne were involved in a feud. Verne was doing play-by-play, but they did a storyline where he just couldn't possibly call a match objectively if Curt Hennig was in the ring. There was too much animosity. And they said to me, would you want to sit in and do some color commentary with Rod? And by God, there it was. And I just went in, just dived right in, and had an opportunity to do that with the AWA for the duration of the time that I was there. They would put me in periodically, and I enjoyed that far, far more than the ring announcing.
Yeah. Well, and it's so interesting that you tell your story, but everybody's got a story like that. I think that when people who are fans and maybe have wanted to become announcers, and they always say, there's no way I could do that because this guy probably, started doing this in high school and then he did college broadcast, and came up through these incredible ranks. And most of the time, somebody's got a story where they were just in the right place at the right time. They were persistent. There's no question about that. And they just didn't go away, which is a lot of people, but that's what it takes. But a lot of times that's the way it happens. There's just, you've got to pay your dues, but at the same time, a lot of times it's something happens and you get that opportunity to jump in there and you sink or swim.
Yeah. And to your point there too, Sean, that's what happened with Okerlund. That's what happened with Ken Resnick. That's what happened with Eric Bischoff. It's just, again, right place, right time. With me, I kind of look at it as, it was an opportunity, but at the same time, it was the timing of everything. It was really a revolving door of announcers at that time in a lot of places. And I'm not so sure, had the AWA not been kind of struggling to maintain their balance and you hang in there as Vince was taking over, I'm not sure that I would have gotten the call. It was just they were going through a lot of systematic changes from top to bottom. So, right place, right time, and whatever the timing, it worked out for me.
Yeah, and you look at all the things that you've done. I mean, obviously not just the love for wrestling, but talent. I mean, I look at some of the list of things that you were involved in over the years, and not only being a talent, but also you had to have some kind of business sense, marketing sense to have been involved in all these things. Host and creative director, Saturday Night at Ringside. Involved with the IWA. Just the list goes on. And I don't know if that was from the School of Hard Knocks or was that something that you had an acumen for, from early on. Where did that come from?
I think the opportunities came seriously from word of mouth, people that I knew, which again is pretty typical, I think, in this business. Somebody would say something to somebody else. The one thing that I didn't do and I don't know how atypical I am, I never sent out tapes. I never sent out audition tapes, videos, audio tapes, nothing to anybody. And in that sense, I don't know, I don't think it was for lack of confidence or that I wasn't ready. I didn't do it. So a lot of the breaks that I got were because, again, I knew somebody. The Saturday night at ringside thing, a perfect example. I had just left the AWA. This is in early 1988. And I got a call from Paul Heyman, who was doing his managing as Paulie Dangerously at the time. And we had worked together in the AWA. And Paul said, there's Joe Pedicino down in Atlanta is hosting a 4-hour wrestling block that they have down there. And they want to move that kind of format and wrestling block to the Twin Cities. Would you be interested in going in and hosting that kind of a show and doing, segues from one syndicated show to the other one? I said, absolutely. So I called Joe Pedicino, went down and auditioned and got the gig. But again, it's because I knew Paul. When I started working for Eddie Sharkey, I had some contacts, and Eddie had known me for years. And Eddie one day said, hey, we're thinking of taping for cable television. You think you could go in and announce some matches? Yeah, absolutely. I just happened to be there. So I wasn't aggressive over the years in pursuing this. A lot of it just fell into my lap. And that's why I say I've been blessed and very fortunate, all things considered, that I made it as far as I did without actually actively pursuing something.
Yeah, and it seems like you had some help along the way. You mentioned a lot of these greats, these legends in the business. Who really, though, as far as mentors who helped you out along the way, who are the ones that really stand out to you?
Well, Nick for sure. And what's interesting about Nick is for years and years, he knew what I knew, Sean, but I never broached the subject with him about the business. And I think in that sense, I gained his trust. So he put in a good word for me. Stan Crusher Kowalski, the late Stan Kowalski, was a great friend of mine. He pushed for me. Eddie Sharkey, Wally Carbo, Larry Hennig. Larry always spoke highly of me. And, I can't thank him enough for that. So I had some good people, some people with experience and a lot of years in the business that vouched for me. So in that sense, I was very blessed.
Yeah, and you look back, I mean, you've been a part of this for how many decades now? I don't know if at the beginning, did you ever think that, this would be your life?
No, never.
Yeah, it's amazing.
And I mean, there's been good times, there's been, not so good times, and the business has changed, of course, but I've always had some kind of foot in the door. I was always doing something with the business, even if it got to be doing a show on cable television or announcing at independent wrestling shows. This is my 35th year doing this, and somehow or other, there hasn't been too many times where I haven't been doing something or have been involved at some point with something in the business. So, yeah, it's in the blood. Nick used to call it a sickness. He said it's a sickness for which there is no cure. And I certainly agree with that. I mean, this is me. This is who I am, and it's what I've done.
And it is amazing because either you're pursuing it or it comes for you. It comes back for you. It's like
that's very true.
It's amazing. When you see what's going on today, and we see these other organizations, AEW. You see some of these. NWA now they're going to have studio shows. This popularity growing in we see a younger audience getting involved. MLW is another one. What do you see out there now as far as what's happening with what we're seeing? Well, we got Wednesday Night Wars again. It's a different night, but what do you see out there now?
Well, I think it's a good thing. Yeah. I think it's a very good thing, and I watch AEW and NWA. I think what happened is that Vince got a little complacent, and the WWE product and creative got complacent. And certainly they're not hurting financially, but I think this is kind of the same thing revisited as what happened with WCW and Nitro back in the day, where WWE was coasting and they were the only game in town. And then all of a sudden, because their product became watered down and they weren't as edgy or whatever it is, the product started to tank a little bit, and all of a sudden these upstarts, they grabbed hold, and I think that's what's happening right now, especially now. I know that WWE just did a pay-per-view the other week, the Hell in the Cell, which was ripped and panned by the critics as far as, the main event or what have you. So very fortuitous that the AEW, is debuting and premiering their stuff at the same time where arguably the WWE is at a low ebb or, not finding favor with their viewing audience. So I think it's great for wrestling. Wrestling has always been cyclical. There's always been ups and downs where the crowds are great, and then there's a lull, and then it picks back up again. But I think for the AEW and the NWA, they're getting the fans interested again, and I think that's a great, great thing.
Yeah, and I kind of look at it that it's like an entertainment vacuum. That if there is, one lesson somewhere, it opens opportunity for these other organizations that are filling that. And I think it's really exciting because it's forcing everybody to step up their game, including the WWE. And I don't see how there's a lose-lose in this for anybody. I think that it's just going to make the business better. There's so many more outlets that these organizations can be a part of, not just, between YouTube and we got Fight TV out there and, now they're back on cable. I think it's just amazing. It's fun to watch. I'm really having a good time kind of taking it all in.
It absolutely is. And when the AEW can get a Cody Rhodes and they can get a Chris Jericho and they can get a Dean Ambrose or Jack Swagger or what have you, people are really noticing. And when Jericho comes out and cuts a promo and takes a shot at WWE creative and gets a huge pop from the crowd, I think that's got to send a message to Vince. I don't think it was a cheap shot so much of it was reality. Your product right now is stale and people aren't interested. I think that arguably the best thing that WWE has going right now are the women. I think that, they've come to the forefront. I think the storylines with the women are exceeding what the men are doing, which I think is great, but it has to be a wake-up call for Vince. For the business as a whole, I think it's tremendous. It's going to start a resurgence, and good for them. Good for the AEW. Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned the women too, and you think back that I know when I was working with the WWF that women were kind of a sideshow, or they'd bring in like the midgets. They would, when business was a little slow or something. And I know that there was even periods, I think in the early 90s, they didn't even have a women's champion. It was like this vacant, title. And you look at it now, and they, like you said, they're just as popular as these male stars, and it really is, and it's very entertaining. And I wouldn't have thought, being from that old school, that if somebody would have told me that, I would have said, really? That's what? But it is, and they are tremendous performers. And you're seeing that getting bigger, and it's also, you see that other organizations now. I know that AEW is going to have this division, and they've got a lot of women, but they're expanding that as well, and it's good all the way around. It's just amazing.
You had mentioned back in the day the women kind of being an afterthought along with the midgets or whatever. You're absolutely right. I mean, when I was growing up, we might get one, maybe two visits from the lady wrestlers in a year's time. And you're right. It always seemed to be either it was a holiday spectacular or it was when the business was slow and they wanted to bring in a specific attraction. But, Vivian Vachon and Kay Noble and Dawn Lemke and Jean Antone back in the day, now all of a sudden, and what's good about it too is the women they're not just valets. They got rid of the pillow fights and the lingerie battle royal. Yeah. Now they're main eventing pay-per-views, and I would say you get a Charlotte Flair or a Becky Lynch or somebody like that, Sasha Banks in the main event, and they're working their asses off, and a lot of times they're stealing the show. So they're not just being given this on a silver platter because they can't work. They're outworking the guys on a lot of levels, and it's paying off for them, and good for them.
Yeah, and you have to go back and give credit to some of these women who came, along the way. And I think of people like Sherry Martel, Sensational Sherry, and how she led the way. I don't think gets the credit that she deserves. That she became as popular a superstar as some of the headliners there, and how she paved the way. And these other women, China, and it's. Back then, that and I don't know if they get the credit at all, but they should be. They should get the credit for paving the way, because look what it's become now, and it's just getting bigger and bigger. And we kind of got off to the side here, but I think it's becoming an important part of what wrestling is becoming now.
It definitely is, and like you said, I would have never imagined that the women, and this is not a sexist comment, it's just, the reality of it is the way the business was, you would never imagine that somebody would be so, they're headlining pay-per-views. It's extraordinary and good for them, and they've earned it, they deserve it, and they're tremendous, just tremendous workers.
Well, all the way around. And, you look back, though, and you must look back fondly at those years of the territories, and those glory days then were just incredible. But it's great to see that after all these years, though, it's still alive and well, and getting bigger every day.
Absolutely. And, and it's I mentioned before, Sean, it's cyclical. There's been down times in the business where you think, oh, well, this is it. Wrestling's dead. The UFC and the MMA, and pretty soon there won't be any pro wrestling because nobody's going to care anymore. And that's not the case. And it takes something like an AEW or an NWA or the women or whatever it might be to revitalize and rejuvenate the interest. And here we are again. Now it's on the upswing, and it's great.
Well, Mick, I really want to thank you for coming on Primetime, and thanks for all you've done over the years to continue this legacy, and especially for the great legends and the stories that come out of Minnesota. But you got to be proud that you were a part of that as well.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity, Sean, and I've always admired your work, and to be on your podcast is an honor. And I really appreciate it, and just keep the old school memories alive. That's the name of the game.
That's why we do this. Hey, how can folks get in touch with you?
What I would suggest, I've got a Facebook page. It's actually called Slick Mix Old School Wrestling, and you just request to be a part of the page, and we put pictures up of the old-time wrestlers or the old videos or what have you, a lot of back-and-forth discussion about the territory days. And that seemed, we got a few thousand people that are on the page. Updated every day. There's never a lull. There's always something new, polls or surveys or contests or what have you. So, again, it's on Facebook, and just look up Slick Mix Old School Wrestling. And there I am.
I bet you've got some great stuff. I bet you got some great memorabilia that you've held on to over the years.
Oh, I have, and it's not going anywhere.
All right, folks, check that out. I for certain am. I'm going to become one of those followers, because I love to see those old pictures and the other stuff that people put up. Old school, man. Old school rules, man.
You got it. Thank you so much, Sean. I really appreciate the opportunity.
All right, man. Thanks for being on Primetime.
You betcha.